Ayo, back at it again with another video. Thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it. So, recording this on November the 24th, 2024, a little bit after midnight, so 12:30 in the morning on November the 24th. And this is kind of the situation as of right now in Ukraine. So this is from deepstatemap.com. This is from the 23rd. Okay, so let's start in the bottom of the map. The whole southern part of the line, there hasn't been any movement, really, more or less, since the Ukrainian counteroffensive around Kherson. There was fighting around, I believe it was Oleshki or Krinky, but I haven't heard a whole lot about that recently. Mostly some movement around the line around Kurakhove and Polohi during the Ukrainian counteroffensive that stalled out. But the part of the line that's kind of critical for Ukraine at the moment is around Kurakhove. So Vuhledar fell, Avdiivka, that was a big one that fell. But the situation around Kurakhove, if we go back a couple of days, the Russians were surrounding Kurakhove, but it looks like they were pushing to its north and to its south. So the situation around Kurakhove, I would say, is critical for Ukraine. Basically, the front line was roughly that about a week or so ago, but it looks like Kurakhove is, most of the area around it is contested, but it looks like the Russians are going to capture Kurakhove. Ultimately, I do think the Ukrainians will probably push back and try and stabilize the line, because right now the bulge at its longest width is about 28 kilometers and distance is roughly 20 kilometers. So there's a bulge in the line around here. I do think the Ukrainians should pull back and stabilize the line, but that's not up to me. But the situation around Kurakhove definitely is critical because the Russians are making advances and it looks like it's more or less surrounded. If you zoom in, basically the Russians are surrounding Kurakhove on three sides, and there's also a bulge around Uspanivka, Hanivka, and Romanivka. So there's basically two bulges in the line. One around Kurakhove, one around Uspanivka, Hanivka, and Romanivka. So technically there's three bulges around the line, but ultimately I do think the bulge around Kurakhove is critical for Ukraine. The situation's not good. The Russians have been looking like they've been pushing along this, I don't know if it's a river or a creek, this body of water from Selidove towards Petrivka. It looks like the Russians are trying to do is push towards Pokrovsk, push towards Shevchenko, and ultimately towards Pokrovsk that way. This major roadway, the Russians have made some progress towards it, but not a whole lot. If we do the ruler, Melanivka to there, the Russians are about 4 kilometers away. That is a pretty important road hub, Pokrovsk, or even road and rail around Pokrovsk. Because if Pokrovsk is under threat, then ultimately the logistics of Ukrainian troops, Ukrainian personnel, material, even heading towards Chasiv Yar, even headed towards Toretsk, would be under threat. If the Russians push their artillery or their rocket systems up, then that roadway could definitely be under bombardment. So the Russians are pushing around Kurakhove. This part of the line from Vuhledar up to Ocheretine is not looking good for the Ukrainians. The Russians have the momentum Russians were able to capture Vuhledar by encircling it. Ukrainians pulled back. Looks like the Russians are pulling the same tactic around Kurakhove. They're trying to surround it, ultimately forcing the Ukrainians back, which I do think they should do because that would stabilize the line because there is a really big bulge in the line right here. Pokrovsk, not a whole lot of movement around there. The Russians are trying to push from Selidove up to Petrivka to Shevchenko and ultimately put Pokrovsk under threat from this direction, from the south and maybe from the southwest. Not a whole lot of movement around Toretsk. The Russians have made some gains, but not a whole lot. Russians have been trying to make headway into this area. A little bit here, a little bit there. Toretsk is still holding for Ukraine. Nelipivka is contested. Not a whole lot of movement in the line around Toretsk or Nelipivka. Some movement. It looks like what the Russians are trying to do around Chasiv Yar. Trying to push along this roadway. Also push along this roadway towards Markove or Maiske. So it looks like what the Russians are trying to do is not do a frontal assault on Chasiv Yar. The Canal microdistrict is under Russian control. Russians have made advances in this part of the town. But it looks like what the Russians are trying to accomplish is a pincer movement around. They've had more success in the south than in the north. Not a whole lot of movement in this part of the line. I do want to touch on two more points. This part up here by Kupiansk, the bulge in the line for Ukraine around Kupiansk is considerable. I think it's bigger than the one around Kurakhove. So the ruler, about 17, 18 kilometers wide, and it looks like about 18 kilometers tall. Looks like the Russians made a push towards Kupiansk. If that is the case, looks like the Russians are trying to force the Ukrainians around Kupiansk, Pischane, Podoli, and all these others, ultimately trying to push the Ukrainians back across the Osko Reservoir, the Osko River. So there's a bulge in the line. The Russians have made an advance around Pischane, forcing their way to the Osko Reservoir. There is a bulge in the line. Looks like the Russians are trying to push towards Kupiansk. If you remember Kupiansk, this was from the Ukrainian counteroffensive around Kharkiv. Izium was a big one, Kupiansk. Two big hubs. Looks like the Russians are trying to push the Ukrainians back towards Kupiansk and across to the other side of the Osko River, Osko Reservoir. The Russians are trying to make a similar thrust around Svatove, ultimately forcing the Ukrainians back across the line. Situation is, I wouldn't say critical, but it's definitely not favoring the Ukrainians. In the north here, there's a bulge in the line around Kupiansk. The Russians are trying to force the Ukrainians back towards Kupiansk and back towards across the other side of the Osko River Reservoir. Not a whole lot of movement around Vovchansk. The Ukrainians, I believe, not a whole lot of movement around Kursk, but I don't think the Ukrainians are able to sustain this incursion for much longer, maybe a couple weeks, a month or so more. Personally, I don't think the Ukrainians should be focusing on Kursk because right now the south front around Kurakhove is collapsing. The Russians are making gains around Kupiansk. I understand why the Ukrainians are doing the incursion into Kursk, but there are other parts of the line that need attention. Because if Kurakhove falls, then the front line would look something like that. The Russians would gain all that territory. If the Russians are able to push the Ukrainians back across the Oskil Reservoir River, then the front would look something like that. And if the Russians are able to capture the territory around Kurakhove, push the Ukrainians back towards the Oskil River Reservoir, then that would put Sloviansk and Kramatorsk as the last two major cities within the Donbass region that the Russians are focusing on, and ultimately there would be another sort of bulge in the line. The Ukrainians might then pull back towards Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, but I'm not sure. That hasn't happened yet. But the situation around Kurakhove, critical. Almost critical around Kupiansk. But definitely the Ukrainians are holding their own around this part of the line. Liman, Chasiv Yar, Toretsk. The line around Pokrovsk is not doing great. So I've been on Ukraine's side for a long time, since the beginning of the war. I still want Ukraine to win, but there are parts of the line where Ukraine is not doing great, especially around Kurakhove, Kupiansk. They're doing decent around this part of the line, but I don't know. There's the incursion into Kursk, but I don't know. Personally, I think pull forces back from Kursk to ultimately defend the line in the north and in the south. Because the middle is holding. The north and the south part of the line are starting to crumble. And it's not looking good around Kurakhove, and it's not looking good around Kupiansk. So that's the Ukraine update. So with that being said, the situation around Kurakhove is critical. I would suggest even the situation around Kupiansk is getting to a critical phase. With that is the end of the video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Deuces.